The deepest assumption behind the idea of a written constitution is that all political power originally comes from the people. If government's power came from within itself, then there would be no natural limits to what government can do and no need for a written constitution. Principle of a written United States Constitution as the supreme law of the land designed for the preservation of liberty. Guest essayist Ben Slomski. The idea of a constitution is an ancient one. The idea of a written constitution, however, is relatively new. To be sure, regimes have long created written documents and legal codes that outline the structure of governing authorities and protect certain rights for citizens and subjects. Yet before the United States Constitution, these written documents were not seen as fundamental for understanding what constitutes a regime. Before Americans chose to produce written constitutions, a constitution was understood in terms of the norms that make up a regime, rather than the words written on any piece of paper. Classical political thought recognized the need to study constitutions. But a regime's constitution was the collection of formal and informal norms that made up a people's way of life in a regime. In Aristotle's Politics, he describes the regime as, quote, an arrangement of a city with respects to its offices, particularly the one that has authority over all matters. For what has authority in the city is everywhere the governing body, and the governing body is the regime, end quote. In other words, the constitution of a city was not a legally binding written document outlining the powers and restrictions on officers. Instead, the Constitution was the way the people of a regime lived and how they chose to organize their governing offices at a given time. Constitutions were much less a matter of fixed law and much more a matter of a people's organic norms. Politics was inherently contingent, as the regime would change in its nature whenever the people changed in their ways and how they chose to organize authority. All of this changed with the United States Constitution. Certainly, the idea of a written document to serve as the fundamental law of government did not spring from the mind of James Madison in 1787 without any antecedents. Early settlers of the American colonies wrote documents outlining the governing principles for their new settlements, such as the Pilgrims' Mayflower Compact. The idea of a model constitution for a regime had been developing in modern political thought, such as in John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. During the American Revolution, states began writing new constitutions even before the Declaration of Independence was published. The Continental Congress passed the Articles of Confederation as the first written constitution for the United States. The document produced by the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to correct the defects of the Articles, which was then ratified by the American people, was the culmination of these efforts. The shift in thinking on the importance of a written constitution cannot be understated. The implicit idea was that a written document outlining the new government's fundamental principles and its structure could establish a legal and political framework to shape the informal norms by which the people constitute themselves. The Constitution would serve as an educational role by informing citizens of the government's organizing principles. Under a written constitution, politics could be at least less contingent than under the older notion of a constitution, as they are written norms that can last across generation to shape political conduct. A written constitution does not guarantee any political outcomes. Of course, as politics will always be subject to the individual choices of human action. The Constitution does, however, distribute authority and establish norms in a way that will make certain outcomes more likely. The Constitution establishes a lasting structure to guide politics because there are further principles embedded in the idea of a written constitution. One of the central ideas behind writing a constitution down is that government's power is not unlimited. Chief Justice John Marshall explains this well in the famed Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. Quote, "To what purpose are powers limited, and to what purpose is that limitation committed to writing? If these limits may, at any time, be passed by those intended to be restrained. The distinction between a government with limited and unlimited powers is abolished if those limits do not confine the persons on whom they are imposed, and if acts prohibited and acts allowed are of equal obligation." End quote. If the government's power is absolute, then there is no reason to write down restrictions on government because it would be free to do whatever it wants. If limits on government authority are written down, then it assumes that these limits will be upheld. Otherwise, there's no point to writing the limits down. Marshall thus proclaims in Marbury that a written constitution is, quote, "what we have deemed the greatest improvement on political institutions," end quote. The deepest assumption behind the idea of a written constitution is that all political power originally comes from the people. If government's power came from within itself, then there would be no natural limits to what government can do and no need for written restrictions. Instead, governmental power is granted by the people, and a constitution serves as a specific statement of what is granted and what authority the people retain for themselves. This delegation of power must be done in an explicit, concrete act by writing it in a public document approved by the people to embody their fundamental will. The written constitution recognizes that the ultimate source of authority remains with the people, who have enacted a document to last for ages, so that the future generations will share the blessings of the supreme law of the land. I thank you for joining us today. I am Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America, and I and Kathy Gillespie, Constituting America's CEO, welcome you to our 13th annual 90-day study. These studies are entitled 90 plus 90 equals 180, History Holds the Key to the Future. This year's study, our 13th annual study, is on the founding principles of America. We thank today's guest essayist, Ben Slomski. He is Assistant Professor of History and Political Science at Ashland University. Thank you for joining us, and please be sure to check out last year's study on American exceptionalism. 90 tools for your toolbox. So the next time you have a discussion with someone about why America is exceptional and someone says, "No, it's not," prove it. You'll have lots of tools in your toolbox. It's a wonderful study. Please check it out. It's archived here at Constituting America. Have a wonderful day, and we'll meet you back here tomorrow.